The cold-hearted mountain man was about to leave the obese girl to die. Her last words stopped him.
I don't know if I can do this
The
anymore.
wind howled through the
We
pines like a
must.
wounded animal,
We have
carrying
come
with
too
it
far
the
to give
bitter
up now.
promise of death. Caleb Grayson pulled his fur collar tighter around his neck, his breath forming white clouds in the frozen air. He'd been tracking elk for 3 days now, following signs through terrain that would break most men. But Caleb wasn't most men. 20 years in these mountains had carved him into something harder than the granite peaks themselves. His rifle hung easy in his calloused hands as he moved through the snow with practiced silence. The forest was his cathedral, solitude his religion. Out here, a man didn't need to pretend, didn't need to smile or make small talk or trust anyone who'd inevitably let him down. The mountains demanded only one thing: survival, and Caleb was very good at surviving. He crested a ridge and stopped. Below, something dark marred the pristine white of the snowfield. At first, he thought it might be a fallen tree or a bear's den, but then he saw the fabric, blue calico, torn and muddied. His jaw tightened. A person, out here, miles from the nearest settlement, in weather that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. Caleb's first instinct was to turn around. He'd learned long ago that other people brought nothing but complications. Every scar on his soul had been carved by someone he'd trusted, someone he'd opened his heart to. The lessons had been brutal, and he'd paid for them in ways that still woke him screaming in the night. He started to pivot his boots in the snow, ready to continue his hunt. The elk wouldn't wait, and whoever was down there had made their own choices. The mountains didn't forgive mistakes, and it wasn't his job to save every fool who wandered into territory they couldn't handle. But something made him pause. Maybe it was the way the wind shifted, carrying a sound that might have been a moan. Maybe it was the flash of movement, a hand lifting weakly from the snow before falling back. Against his better judgment, against every hard-learned lesson, Caleb found himself descending the slope, his boots crunching through the icy crust. As he drew closer, he could make out more details. A young woman, heavy-set, with dark hair plastered to her face with sweat despite the cold. Her dress was shredded in places, revealing scratches and bruises. Blood stained the snow beneath her leg. She'd been running from something, that much was clear, and whatever it was had nearly killed her. Caleb knelt beside her, checking for a pulse. It was there, weak but steady. Her lips were blue, her skin dangerously pale. Hypothermia, probably within the hour. He could carry her to his cabin. It was only 2 miles north. But then what? He'd be stuck with her until she healed or died, and either outcome meant complications he didn't want. The ghosts of his past whispered in his ear, "Don't do it. Don't open yourself up again. Remember what happened last time. Remember Sarah." He stood up, brushing snow from his knees. The smart thing, the sensible thing, was to keep walking. She was already unconscious. She wouldn't even know he'd been here. Nature would take its course, as it always did in these mountains. One less problem for him to deal with. Caleb shouldered his rifle and turned to leave. "Please." The word was barely a whisper, so faint he almost missed it. He froze. The girl's eyes had opened, dark brown, fever bright, fixed on his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Her cracked lips moved, forming words with obvious effort. "If you leave me here to die," she coughed, the sound wet and painful. "You'll never know what you're missing. The most precious thing in this world. Caleb stared at her, caught off guard by the strange statement. She wasn't begging for mercy or promising rewards. There was no manipulation in those eyes, just a sad, knowing acceptance mixed with something else. Hope, maybe, or challenge. "What are you talking about?" The words came out harsher than he intended. A ghost of a smile touched her frozen lips. "Someone who sees you, not the walls you've built. Someone who could—" Another cough racked her body. "Could love even a cold-hearted mountain man." The words hit him like a physical blow. How could she know? How could this dying stranger see into the carefully constructed fortress he'd built around his heart? For a moment, he felt exposed, vulnerable in a way he hadn't been since Sarah had left him standing in the ruins of everything he'd believed in. "You don't know anything about me," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "I know. You stopped." Her eyes began to close again. "Most wouldn't have. That means something." Caleb watched her slip back into unconsciousness, her words echoing in his mind. Damn her. Damn her for saying exactly what would worm past his defenses. He could still walk away, should walk away, but those eyes, they'd seen him, really seen him, in a way no one had in years. With a curse that would have made a sailor blush, Caleb bent and lifted the girl into his arms. She was heavier than he expected, but he'd carried full-grown deer through worse terrain. The weight was manageable. It was everything else about this decision that felt impossible to bear. The 2-mile trek to his cabin took nearly an hour. The girl, he didn't even know her name, remained unconscious the entire time, her head lolling against his chest. Caleb tried not to think about what he was doing or why. He focused on the physical, one foot in front of the other, navigating the treacherous paths he knew by heart, keeping his burden balanced. His cabin materialized through the trees like a mirage. It wasn't much. 1 room, rough-hewn logs, a stone fireplace, but it was weatherproof and warm. More importantly, it was his sanctuary, the one place in the world where the past couldn't reach him. Until now. He kicked open the door and carried the girl inside, laying her on his bed, the only bed. For the next several hours, Caleb worked with the efficiency of long practice. He stripped off her wet, frozen clothes, trying to ignore the vulnerability of her unconscious form and the way society's cruel words echoed in the back of his mind. He'd heard enough proper folks mock people for their appearance, as if the size of a body determined the worth of a soul. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, started a roaring fire, heated water, and cleaned her wounds. The leg injury was bad, a deep gash that would need stitches. He had whiskey for antiseptic and a steady hand from years of field dressing game. She woke when he started stitching, her scream cutting through the cabin's silence. Caleb grabbed her shoulders, holding her down. "Stay still. I'm trying to help you." Her wild eyes focused on his face, recognition dawning. You came back." "Didn't have much choice after what you said." He returned to his work, needle-piercing skin. "This is going to hurt. There's leather there. Bite down on it." She did, tears streaming down her face as he worked. But she didn't scream again, just gripped the bed frame with white-knuckled hands. When he finally tied off the last stitch, she released the leather and collapsed back against the pillows, gasping. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb grunted, cleaning his needle in the fire. "Don't thank me yet. We're snowed in for at least a week, maybe more. And I'm not exactly what you'd call good company." "I'm Lydia," she said. "Lydia May. from Redemption Creek. Caleb. He didn't offer his last name. Names were dangerous. They created connections, obligations. What were you running from? Lydia's face darkened. The Slate brothers. They run things in Redemption Creek, or think they do. My father owed them money, gambling debts. When he died last month, they said the debt transferred to me. I told them I had nothing to give. They said— She swallowed hard. They said they'd take me instead. Sell me to a brothel in Denver that supposedly specialized in girls like me. I ran. Caleb's hand stilled. The Slate brothers. He knew of them. Cruel men who'd built their empire on the suffering of others. And Lydia had been running through mountain wilderness in winter alone to escape them. The fact that she'd survived this long spoke to either incredible luck or unexpected resilience. They'll come looking, he said flatly. I know. Lydia met his eyes. I'm sorry. I've brought trouble to your door, but I'd rather die free in these mountains than live as their prisoner. Something in her words resonated with Caleb. Hadn't he chosen the same thing? Isolation over betrayal, loneliness over vulnerability. They were more alike than he'd initially thought. Over the next few days, an uneasy routine developed. Caleb slept on the floor by the fire while Lydia recovered in his bed. He brought her water, shared his meager supplies of dried meat and beans. She was surprisingly easy to be around. She didn't chatter mindlessly or demand attention. Instead, she watched him with those dark, intelligent eyes, occasionally asking questions about his life on the mountain. At first, he answered in monosyllables, but gradually the silence of the cabin, broken only by the crackling fire and the wind outside, became oppressive. And Lydia had a way of asking questions that didn't feel invasive, that somehow made him want to answer. How long have you been up here? She asked one evening. 5 years, give or take. That's a long time to be alone. It's better than the alternative. She was quiet for a moment. What's the alternative? Caleb stared into the fire, memories he'd tried to bury clawing their way to the surface. Trusting people who don't deserve it, getting your heart ripped out, losing everything that matters. Someone hurt you badly, Lydia said softly. It wasn't a question. For a long moment, Caleb said nothing. The story was locked inside him, a festering wound he'd never lanced. But something about this girl, this stranger who'd stumbled into his life and refused to leave it, made the words come easier. Her name was Sarah, he finally said, his voice rough. We met in St. Louis back when I was working as a timber scout. She was beautiful, charming, everything I thought I wanted. We got married after 6 months. I was young and stupid and believed in things like love and forever. He poured himself whiskey, downed it in one swallow. I worked myself half to death building us a homestead outside town. Good land, close to water, fertile soil. I was going to make something of myself, give her the life she deserved. For 3 years, I broke my back clearing fields, building our house log by log, raising livestock. Sarah seemed happy enough, or so I thought. What happened? Lydia asked gently. I came back early from a trapping expedition. Found her in our bed with Marcus Thornton, a gambler who'd been working the saloons in town. They'd been carrying on for months, apparently. Everyone knew except me. The bitterness in his voice could have curdled milk. She didn't even have the decency to look ashamed, just laughed and said she'd been bored playing house with a man who smelled like pine sap and animal blood. Said Marcus knew how to treat a real lady. Caleb's hands clenched into fists, the memory still raw after all these years. I told them to get out. Thornton just smirked and said they were already planning to. Then Sarah told me she'd sold the homestead, forged my signature on the deed, took everything we had and gave it to Thornton to pay off his debts. Even my father's pocket watch, the only thing I had left of him. Oh, Caleb, Lydia breathed. The law wouldn't help. Thornton had connections, and I was just a nobody who'd married above his station. They left for Denver the next day. I stayed in town long enough to drink myself nearly to death, got into fights with anyone who looked at me wrong. Finally, the sheriff gave me a choice: leave or get thrown in jail. He gestured at the cabin around them, so I left. Came up here where people couldn't reach me, couldn't hurt me. Spent the first year half hoping a bear would finish what I'd started with the whiskey. But the mountains don't let you give up that easy. They make you fight or die. No middle ground. So I fought. And somewhere along the way, I decided it was easier to feel nothing than to risk feeling everything again. The silence stretched between them. Caleb expected pity, or worse, sympathy. But when Lydia spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than pitying. "She didn't deserve you," she said. "Neither did Thornton. But Caleb, you've been punishing yourself for 5 years for their sins. How long are you going to let them control your life?" The question struck him like a physical blow. "I'm not. You are. You're up here, alone, refusing to trust anyone, refusing to feel anything. They stole your homestead and your belongings. Don't let them steal the rest of your life, too." Caleb wanted to argue, to defend the walls he'd built so carefully, but the words rang true in a way that made his chest ache. He'd thought he was protecting himself by isolating up here. Instead, he'd just given Sarah and Thornton exactly what they'd wanted: to break him completely. "It's not that simple," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It never is?" Lydia shifted in the bed, wincing at the pain in her leg. "But Caleb, the world is full of people like Sarah and Thornton. It's also full of people who aren't. If you close yourself off to everyone, you're not protecting yourself. You're just making sure you'll always be alone." Over the following days, Caleb found himself thinking about her words. He'd spent 5 years believing that isolation was strength, that needing no one meant no one could hurt him. But watching Lydia recover, seeing her determination to survive despite everything she'd been through, made him question that philosophy. One morning, about 10 days after he'd found her, Lydia asked him to teach her to survive in the mountains. "Why?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Because I can't go back to Redemption Creek, not while the slates are still free. And I won't spend my life dependent on someone else's mercy, not even yours." She met his eyes steadily. "I need to be able to take care of myself. Will you teach me?" Something in her request resonated with Caleb. This wasn't weakness seeking strength. This was strength recognizing it needed to grow stronger. Against his better judgment, against all his instincts, to keep distance between them, he agreed. Teaching Lydia became a revelation. She fell in the snow, struggled with the traps, nearly shot herself the first time she tried to load a rifle, but she never quit, never complained about the cold or the difficulty or the way her body ached from unfamiliar exertions. She just got up and tried again, her determination almost frightening in its intensity. And as he watched her transform, saw her soft hands develop calluses, her uncertain movements become confident, her fear of the wilderness turn into respect, Caleb realized something terrifying. He was starting to care about her, not just as a responsibility or a person he'd saved, but as someone whose presence made the silence of his cabin feel less like sanctuary and more like prison. One evening, as they sat by the fire after a long day checking trap lines, Lydia looked at him with those perceptive eyes. "Tell me about your father," she said, "the one who gave you the pocket watch." Caleb stiffened. He never talked about his father, not even before Sarah, but somehow, with Lydia, the words came. "John Grayson, toughest man I ever knew and the kindest. He was a trapper, worked these mountains before they had names, lost my mother to fever when I was 8. After that, it was just him and me." A rare smile touched Caleb's lips. "He taught me everything, how to track, how to survive, how to read the land. But more than that, he taught me about honor, about keeping your word, about treating people fairly, about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. He sounds like a good man." "He was. Best man I ever knew." Caleb's voice roughened. "He died when I was 16. Heart just gave out one day while we were checking lines. I buried him up on Eagle Ridge, where you can see 3 states on a clear day. He always loved that view." "Is that why you came back to the mountains? To be close to him?" Caleb hadn't thought about it in those terms, but Lydia was right. Maybe I came back because this was the last place I felt like I belonged. The last place where I was with someone who actually gave a damn about me." "Your father would be sad," Lydia said quietly, "to see what you've become. Not because you're in the mountains, because you've given up on people. From what you've told me, he believed in helping others, in standing up for them. But you were going to leave me to die." The accusation stung because it was true. "I'm not my father." "No, you're not. But you could be. The man who saved me, who's teaching me to survive, who sits here talking to me every night. That's your father's son. The cold-hearted hermit you pretend to be. That's Sarah's creation. Which one do you want to be?" Before Caleb could answer, they heard it. Dogs barking in the distance, coming closer. The Slates had found them. What followed was a desperate flight through the winter darkness, a brutal fight in the caves, blood on snow and stone. But through it all, Caleb felt something shifting inside him. Every time he looked at Lydia, her face set with determination, her hand steady on the stolen pistol, her body positioned protectively even as blood seeped from his wound, he felt the ice around his heart cracking. When they finally made their stand in the cave, when Lydia killed to protect him and he realized he'd do the same for her, Caleb understood the truth. His father had been right all along. Isolation wasn't strength. Connection was. Having someone to fight for, someone to protect, someone whose life mattered more than his own solitude, that was what made survival worth the struggle. "Lydia," he said, his voice rough with pain and emotion as she bandaged his wound, "you changed me. I've spent 5 years trying to feel nothing, to need nothing, to be nothing but survival. But I'm more afraid of losing you than anything else in this world." Tears streamed down her face. "You're not going to lose me, and I'm not going to lose you. We're going to get out of this cave, and we're going to build a life together. You hear me?" "Kinda hard not to with you yelling." He managed a real smile this time, the first genuine one in 5 years. "But yeah, I hear you." The journey down the mountain, through Caleb's fever and pain, through Lydia's exhaustion and fear, was the hardest thing either had ever done. But they did it together, and when they finally reached Redemption Creek, When justice finally came for the Slates, when the doctor stitched Caleb's wounds and pronounced him lucky to be alive, they stood together against the whispers and stares. Let them talk. Let them judge. They'd survived worse. As Caleb recovered, as they made plans for their future, he found himself thinking often about his father, about the lessons John Grayson had taught him, not just about survival in the wilderness, but about survival as a human being, about the importance of connection, of trust, of opening your heart even when it was terrifying. One day, when he was strong enough to travel, Caleb took Lydia up to Eagle Ridge. They stood together looking out over the endless expanse of mountains, and Caleb felt his father's presence like a benediction. "I think he'd like you," Caleb said, taking Lydia's hand. "You're stubborn enough to be a Grayson." Lydia laughed, the sound carrying on the wind. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is." Caleb pulled her close, his other arm wrapped around her waist. "Everything he tried to teach me about being a good man, I forgot it all after Sarah, buried it under anger and ice, but you dug it back up. You made me remember who I was supposed to be." "We did that together," Lydia corrected gently. "I showed you who you could be. You chose to become that person again. That's all you, Caleb." They built their homestead on the mountain's edge, a compromise between wilderness and civilization. And every day, as Caleb worked the land with Lydia beside him, as they opened their home to others who'd been broken by the world, he felt his father's pride like sunlight on his face. He'd been lost for 5 years, frozen in place by betrayal and pain. But Lydia had thawed him, not with pity or sympathy, but with challenge and truth. She'd looked at the cold-hearted mountain man everyone else saw and recognized the grieving, hurt, fundamentally good person underneath. And in doing so, she'd given him back not just his heart, but his father's legacy. The understanding that real strength wasn't isolation, but in having the courage to connect, to trust, to love, even when it was terrifying. Years later, sitting on their porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Caleb pulled Lydia close. In his pocket, he carried a watch, not his father's, which was lost forever, but one Lydia had saved months to buy him. It didn't matter that it wasn't the original. What mattered was what it represented, time not wasted, not frozen, but moving forward, together. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For stopping me that day in the snow, for seeing past what I'd become to what I could be, for giving me back my life." Lydia leaned her head on his shoulder. "You gave me mine first. I'd say we're even." And in the gathering dusk, with the mountains standing eternal witness, they sat together, no longer defined by their painful pasts, but by the future they'd chosen to build. The cold-hearted mountain man and the girl he'd almost abandoned had become something neither could have been alone.